Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back from another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Trump warns homeless to move out of D.C. immediately from themirror.com, posted by Swan Pinky Dan, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for homeless encampments in the cities. But ultimately, people are going to justify what they want to justify. If they want to have homeless encampments, they'll have homeless encampments. I think it would be authoritarian to move them. Plus, a lot of cities like D.C. are already, pretty much Democrat-run shitholes where, they let the poor get away with whatever they want to, as long as, they have the right skin color and vote Democratic all the time. So, ultimately, I do think stuff like this is well intentioned. I do think the Republican push to clean up cities is something that is well intentioned. But I think the Libertarian position is, you shouldn't be using force against someone, even if they're in the way and just loafing around on the street all day. I personally don't think people should be tripping out on drugs in the street all day. But the Libertarian position is, if you want to do that for your body, that should be your choice, not that of the state. I would like to clean up the cities, but I think the cities, if you want to live in a city, you know what you're getting at this point. The cities are too far gone to really be fixed at this point. If you want to try fixing them, that's fine. But I personally think even if it's well intentioned, authoritarianism is still authoritarianism, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have thoughts posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that looks like a tweet from SpinArt7. And they tweeted, "Remember, kids, if you see someone shoplifting food, no, you didn't." And I guess I could see the argument there. Ultimately, if people do want to shoplift, I do, they'll justify what they justify. But I personally do think, stealing is wrong, but because that's just, you shouldn't be stealing, even if you are hungry, because ultimately, the business owner gets hurt. And they're the ones who are providing food for the community in the first place. And just because he might not have the resources to pay for it doesn't mean it's justified stealing it. Personally, I think if an object or thing is physical, stealing it is wrong from the possession of whoever owns it is wrong. And yeah, I'm a little more lenient when it comes to non-physical things, like things over the internet. I personally think if people want to pirate stuff, that's stealing too, and I think that's wrong as well. But, people will justify what they justify, and, if people want to steal things, that's fine. But, a society, when people start stealing things, societal trust is going to collapse, and no one's going to trust each other anymore, and then everyone's just going to start hoarding stuff for themselves, and there'll be no reason to trade anymore, because people will just lose faith in the institutions that will allow them to trade. So that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have LPNH Does It Again, posted by Gen Z Genji, and they said, "How are we feeling about this one?" And that was them quote tweeting Gold Pill. I made another one. I don't think it's as good as the 14 words, but you can still try it. LPNH at Jeremy Kaufman, and that looks like a Nazi-style Libertarian Party of New Hampshire logo with kind of like with written in German kind of text with kind of the Nazi eagle on it. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the LPNH's Nazi-esque edgelording, but ultimately, that's all pretty much social media is at this point, is edgelording and engagement bait. That's their brand. I personally don't really care for it, but if they want to do that, that's on them. And yeah, ultimately, I don't really care for the more wokertarian style messaging that the Libertarian Party of Louisiana has either. But, ultimately, people will justify what they justify, and that's very much the contradiction of running a Libertarian Party in the first place. Libertarians believe in individuals, while a political party is an inherently collectivist institution, so that's why I would say the Libertarian position is, free speech, even if I might disagree with it, you should be able to say or justify doing whatever you want to, as long as nobody else is getting hurt. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump demands 15% cut of Nvidia and AMD sales to China from finance.yahoo.com, posted by XGH-Ty737. And yeah, personally, I don't think Trump should be Trump or the government should be taking cuts out of any private corporation. But, ultimately, as I stated in the past, big business and big government are oftentimes joined at the hip. And yeah, if the government has the legal monopoly to force justify taking whatever resources or money they want to from private corporations, and I personally don't think that's libertarian. But ultimately, when you have the legal monopoly of the use of force, that's ultimately what makes the state legitimate in the first place, and that's why they can pretty much justify whatever they want to. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Watch Trump puts Washington, D.C. police under federal control, deploys National Guard from CNBC.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, this is just another Reddit outrage headline, I guess. We talked about the D.C. homeless earlier. And yeah, pretty much Reddit is just outrage headline after outrage headline. Other social media isn't doing much better at this point. But in that regard, I think Reddit is even starting to outdo cable news when it comes to, just constant outrage farming and moving on from outrage to outrage. And yeah, I personally don't really, as I said earlier, I personally don't really care for it. But, Reddit is always going to be going on about whatever the current outrage is, and then they'll eventually move on to whatever the next outrage is, and the next outrage is, and it just gets tiring after a while. If you want to say Orange Man bad every day, that's on you, but eventually, when you're at day like 3,500 or so, you just stop, all the headlines just start to blend together. Then we have, I do not want to hear another word from conservatives saying Trump is about freedom, FTP. Fuck that Puto was by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross post from the law subreddit. Trump says police are now allowed to do whatever the hell they want. And yeah, I personally don't think police should be able to do whatever they want, but ultimately, the government can justify doing whatever it feels like since they have the legal monopoly in the use of force, and oftentimes there's no way to go after them since they control the police, the military, and the courts, and pretty much all institutions of the law in any given territory. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, this is the Modern Republican Party, posted by Otso the Lumberjack, and that's a picture of the Gadsden flag snake, but it's kissing the boot, and it says, please drown everyone but me, sir. And yeah, I guess I would agree with that. The Republican Party doesn't care about freedom and individual liberty, just like the Democratic Party doesn't. They might be better about hiding it, but, they both are two sides of the same shitty coin. That's why they're pretty much a uniparty. Although you do have some exceptions like Thomas Massey, but as I said, and Rand Paul's another one, but as I said, they're exceptions rather than the rule. Then we have martial law in D.C. posted by Donald Key, and that's crosswords from the military subreddit. And of course, Reddit is always on, Trump's a fascist martial law. Personally, I don't really care for martial law, but I do think, that is the most legitimate rule by the state. Ultimately the state is legitimate because it controls the military and the military's use of force. And, I'm not saying libertarians for martial law should be a thing, but, ultimately the martial law is the natural state of things when the state has the monopoly on legal use of force. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have MTG explodes over report exposing massive wealth jump from thedailybeast.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, of course Reddit doesn't like MTG because, she's a member of the out group. And yeah, I personally think she's probably one of the better people in Congress. She's willing to call out Israel on its bullshit, unlike a lot of Congress members. But yeah, I personally don't care about, how people like her use the state to enrich themselves. I think that's what this article is going into. And yeah, ultimately, that's what everyone's going to do when it comes to the government. The government's inherently going to be a grift run by self-interested actors. All people are self-interested to some extent, and the politicians are probably the most self-interested, and they'll just, grift all and take all our money because they have the resources to do so. And yeah, that's why I personally think if it were up to me, we wouldn't have elections or politicians. We just have random people in government positions, maybe homeless people, because and it would all government work would be done on a volunteer basis rather than a payment basis, because as it is now, as it's structured now, it's pretty much just a massive grift where actors who seek to enrich themselves are allowed to do pretty much whatever they want to. Look at Nancy Pelosi and insider trading, and they pretty much all do insider trading. And yeah, it's not something I personally care for, but ultimately that's very much the system as it's set up currently. The state is the politicians are able to pretty much loot the treasury, and the people are able to do nothing about it. And you can try voting, but people are already either up the Democratic Party's ass or the Republicans Party ass. That's like 40% of people will vote Democrat no matter what. 40% of people will vote Republican no matter what. And that just goes to show you how people will fall for whatever partisan narratives there are, and just allow their side to continue looting the treasury. But when the other side loots the treasury, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Supreme Court formally asked to overturn landmark same-sex marriage ruling. Original title from abcnews.go.com, posted by Dr. 07. And then Monday Image 13 posted the same thing. And they added the latter one, Monday Image 13 added, it seems a conservative minority in this country is trying to use the power of the state to strip the rights away from millions of Americans. And yeah, I just did my own post about this. And I said, libertarian perspectives on same-sex marriage. And I said, it's back in the headlines again after Ken Davis, remember her, filed some legal complaint in regards to Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court case that legalized it nationwide. Back when the case first passed, I used to be really for it, but since then I have fallen more in line with perspectives like this one, and I linked to a tweet from Mark J. Randazzo tweeted, I don't think anyone's going to like my take on this. I think we should overturn Obergefell, but in doing so we should outlaw marriage as a legal construct, permit civil unions between any two people, and leave marriage to the faith individuals. And that's very much my perspective. And yeah, and I added after that, I said, I don't think the state should be involved in concepts like marriage. It should be up to each individual the concept however they feel like. Even if I might personally disagree with it, like when an adult tries to marry a minor, I personally don't think minors can consent to such an arrangement, but I really don't like forcing my views on others. If you truly love someone or something and want to say you were married to them, you shouldn't need the state to legitimize it. People need to find legitimacy in their own terms rather than the terms of others. Of course, Redditors will take any overturn of Obergefell whatsoever as justification for their victim mentality. That's probably the biggest reason I hope it doesn't happen. Regardless of what happens, though, I expect Redditors just move on to whatever the next outrage is. This website has somehow found a way to outdo even cable news when it comes to moving from outrage to outrage. Other social media is much better, to be fair. Yeah, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump team looking to create squad of 600 soldiers ready to deploy at a moment's notice to quash civil unrest, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross-post from the law subreddit. And yeah, as I said earlier, I personally don't really care for martial law and the police or the military in the streets, but that's ultimately where the state's authority comes from. When there's chaos, the state is usually expected to be the one to restore order, but of course Reddit doesn't care for it because the orange man is the one doing it. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And I'm going to do a bonus post today, never posted made to the Libertarian Party subreddit, Libertarian Party USA subreddit, and I said, what makes state legitimate from a libertarian perspective? With a lot of people increasingly seeing the government as nothing but a bunch of corrupt and power-hungry losers, I thought it would be important to make a list of what ultimately gives us legitimacy. That one, legal monopoly on the use of force. Only actors, namely the military and the police, that are under the full control of the state, are allowed to legally use force, and any other use of force is either incredibly stigmatized or outright illegal. Honestly, that's pretty much the only reason, but I decided that list of them wasn't that deep, so I had a few others as well. 2, resource control. The state controls a vast amount of resources, such as weapons, raw materials, and anything else that it feels like having. 3, control of the education system. This is a big one. All educational institutions must be accredited by the state, if not outright controlled by them. Any other educational institutions are either banned or stigmatized. 4, the will of the people / democracy. The state needs to be seen as legitimate by the majority of the population, otherwise it risks having its authority challenged and possibly negated entirely. Democracy, though extremely flawed, is generally seen as the best way of going about this. 5, territory control. The state controls all land in a given territory and is the sole arbiter of the law from its boundaries. 6, narrative control. All media narratives are looked at through a statist lens. Anything that goes against the statist perspective is stigmatized. And that's my list. You agree on whatever ones would you add? And yeah, that just goes to show you how, ultimately the state legitimacy, I added those other ones, but it does come from that they control the military and the police and the court and legal institutions as well. And, personally, I don't think the state should be in control, although I think, each individual should be able to justify doing whatever they feel like. And yeah, I would say the vast majority of states are, they should be voluntary, but the vast majority of states are involuntary as they are currently. You have no choice but to obey whatever laws they have, and your only other options are to either hope the laws you dislike are changed or move to another state entirely. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.